This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm Stephanie Disler, producer of the show. On today's episode, Mike and David are joined by Scott Marion, Executive Director of the Center for Assessment, to discuss their new paper, The Case for State Testing, a timely defense of why states should continue annual assessments even if federal testing requirements are rolled back. Then, on the Research Minute, Adam Tyner covers a study comparing surveys and test scores as measures of school quality and predictors of long-term student success. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show, starting now.
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now please join me in welcoming our special guest for this week, Scott Marion. Scott, welcome to the show.
Hey, Mike. Hi, David.
Yeah, great to have you. And yes, welcoming, as always, our co-host, David Griffith. David, welcome back as well.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Scott.
Hey, good to see you guys again.
Yeah, Scott, we were teasing you earlier. Scott is in one of those vacation rentals with the classic kind of vacation rental art on the wall. I love it. So, of course, I think that painting behind you now is going to, in the future, be taxed at like a 44% rate. So
exactly,
we're going to have to find made in America Airbnb art going forward.
Exactly.
Hey, for those of you that don't know, Scott is the executive director of the Center for Assessment, which is a center that's been doing great work for many years on that topic, working directly with states, putting out research, white papers. And he is, in fact, going to talk about a new paper they've got out. Let's do that on Ed Reform Update. Okay, Scott, this new paper, it's called The Case for State Testing, which, by the way, I like the name. Very clear, optimized for Google search, not complicated. But it's a great, timely defense of why states should keep testing students, even if the federal requirements went away, which I will say I'm hopeful that they will not go away, but a lot of people out there worried that perhaps this administration would allow a state to get out of those requirements. And this paper says, well, even if that happened, here's why states should keep testing anyways. I found it to be really persuasive. Of course, you're preaching to the choir here, but let's talk about some of the principles in this paper, because I think that the way you position it is right on target. Can you talk about what's the first principle you have in here?
So, we argue that all tests are designed for specific purposes and uses. And we joke that there really is no Swiss Army knife for testing, that, one thing could do all these things. And I liken it to, if you ever tried to use the scissors on a Swiss Army knife, you know what I mean? Right? It just doesn't work for certain things. And state tests have really important functions. They don't do everything. They're not meant to inform instruction, day-to-day instruction, but they are really useful for monitoring educational achievement and growth across students, across schools, across districts within a state. And then, of course, we have the National Assessment of Educational Progress to go across states. But within a state, different than NAEP, this tests essentially every kid at a specific grade level in those subject areas. So it is that shining a light and being able to monitor if we're going to institute this kind of reform. For instance, Mississippi instituted that fabulous comprehensive reading reform. They saw the results in their state assessment, and then it was corroborated by NAEP, but they saw those results in their state assessment, and they saw variability. Where is it working well? Which districts is it working well? Where is it not working well? What else do we need to do to help those districts better implement these reading reforms?
Yeah, no, and I think it's important for people to understand that NAEP gives us a lot. I was talking to a reporter recently. I think she's probably fairly near the beach, trying to understand NAEP versus state tests, and she was asking about, the progress that a state was making or lack thereof. And I tried to say, well, because we don't have student level data from NAEP, we just have these cohorts, kind of snapshots in time. We really can't answer the question of whether schools and students are making more progress now, say, than they were a year ago or before the pandemic. But you can know that with a good state test, right? And that's really important. The growth piece in particular is something you cannot get from NAEP, and you can only get from these high quality state assessments.
Yeah. And that's a really important point, the growth especially, because we know this strong relationship between achievement, not perfect, thankfully, between, socioeconomic status and other variables between that and achievement. But we see growth, even schools that have a lot of kids who have various life challenges are still able to get those kids to grow if they're effective teaching and leading in that school. So growth is a nice complement that we get with these state assessments now.
Yeah. Then you say evaluation and continuous improvement is the second purpose of these. And here you're talking about evaluating schools, evaluating districts, maybe in some cases programs, initiatives. This is the best data we've got to do all those sorts of things, right? And I like this too. I've been trying to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't use the word accountability as much. Frankly, we're not doing much real accountability these days. What we are still in some places trying to do is to evaluate the effectiveness of schools. And by the way, we should try to evaluate the effectiveness of districts more than we do right now as well.
I completely agree. That's my next little foray. Yeah. And you're right. Evaluation is accountability is a special case of evaluation, right? And it's just putting consequences and or different type of metrics on it. But what evaluation, this great professor I had, Ernie House, years ago, said, what's the difference between evaluation and research? And research asked, does X cause Y? Evaluation asked, is X good? And if you want to know, I'm implementing, whether it's a new reading reform, new math reform, and I want to know, is it working as it's intended? Well, I could do these near measures close to the classroom, close to the kid and see, but ultimately we care, can they transfer that to demonstrate that on a measure of the state standards, the knowledge and skills kids are expected to learn? And in fact, the state assessment is a terrific outcome variable in an evaluation question. Is I'm doing these things, and people might feel better about it, and that's good. I'm all for people feeling better, but ultimately, are kids learning anything, and can we pick that up?
Right.
So that's what we think, and we think it should be used more. We think the accountability, I'm with you, accountability is not many consequences right now. So I think if we could help states reframe this, and we're trying to evaluate and help schools use these data to continuously improve, we'd be in better shape. And I have a couple of colleagues of mine who are really working on some frameworks to try to make this easier for folks.
That's great. All right. Then the third is transparency and public engagement. For the sake of time, I think we'll leave it. That's pretty clear to me and transparent.
Something that you guys have been touting for years.
Yes. And then number 4, and I think this is really important, is signaling rich learning expectations. This one seems key, right? Because I hear people say all the time, hey, can we figure out how to make these tests just a lot shorter? Why does it have to be so long? Or we can maybe just have, not every kid has to take every question. We could do some sampling or something. And this was where you get to the point that, to the extent that we are using these tests to evaluate schools, we want to encourage high quality instruction. And we don't want to go back to the bad old days, say during No Child Left Behind era, when we did have these shorter and lower quality tests, and we worried that they drove some pretty poor instruction, the drill and kill stuff. Is that what you're getting at here?
That is, you could talk about overreach of federalism and things like that with the consortia, but they produced, Park and Smart Balance, produced the best test we had seen, and frankly, particularly in Park, that we had seen in 20, 30 years of state testing. Now, we know the consortia are, remnants of themselves, but what remained is some of those high quality test questions. Because if you tell a teacher, if you show them a content standard or an objective, they're pretty good at understanding what they need to do. But if you show them a test item, kids have to solve that kind of problem. They really get it. And so then we want that. Now, we don't want, you go far to one side, just mimic the test and everything is just test prep. We don't want that, but we want to signal the kinds of things that we want going on in classrooms. Exactly.
Yeah. Now, finally, I want to get into what you say these state tests should not be used for, or that we shouldn't expect them to be used for. Back to your back to your Swiss Army knife example, which is to make them instructionally useful. Right. And by the way, this is the claim that those of us in testing like to claim. This is going to help teachers improve instruction. And you're saying the state tests really can't do that very well.
Yeah. And a colleague and I, Carla Evans, had a book published last year on instructionally useful assessments. Just a little plug, but it's because we got really upset. We felt like teachers were being asked to, make lemonade, but you're not even giving them lemons, and so they're just being asked to do something that's impossible to do. And so we feel really strongly that the purposes of state testing are these monitoring and evaluation kinds of things, and that's great. But to use it for instruction, they're given at the end of the year. The results come back at the end of, after the school year is over. So how is it going to be instructional use for those kids? You might use it for planning the next year, but that's more of an evaluation framework. And so you need things closer to the instructional moment to be useful for instruction. It's not what they're designed for, and we shouldn't try to pretend.
And what you're saying, but we do need those tests, right?
That's
So
right.
you are in favor of districts have gone out and they purchase tests that are that provide this kind of feedback. Maybe you think some of them are, I'm sure you think some are better than others. Or they try to develop their own.
Yeah, and I want things more embedded in curriculum that would really be instruction, day-to-day kinds of things. But the interim tests have a role, but if they could provide that more frequent and fine grain size information that we need for instruction. And that's the balanced assessment system.
And that's what we're about. So I think it's very compelling. Now, here's my next question. And David, I want to get you thinking about this as well, right? I mean, if we're saying, okay, we don't need to make them instructionally useful, right? Though we do care about the instructional signals they send, right? We do want them to be able to measure growth, all right? I guess the question is there anything we could be doing that gets us away from what we're doing now, especially anything that could take less time? Could we have kids tested only every other year and still be able to do growth? Is there any kind of sampling that you could imagine that could work and still allow for growth? Is there other stuff, if a state out there is thinking, hey, I want to do some kind of waiver request that still gets at the heart of what we're after here, but maybe lessens the political temperature on testing because it would take less time. I mean, is there anything in these categories? I'd be curious, David and Scott, both of your opinions on that.
David, you want to weigh in first? Go ahead.
Well, Scott may contradict me here, but I'm going to say no.
Okay.
I maybe Scott has some bright ideas. The whole conversation makes me pretty nervous. It sounds good until you start thinking it through, right? And you realize, kids are they're different, right? You can't infer how one kid is doing from how the kid right next door to that kid is doing, right? So, just moving to like a sampling strategy, right? By definition, you're saying we're not going to know how some of our kids are doing and how much progress they've made in the last year, right? And we kind of just alluded to transparency, but that's such an absolutely bedrock form of transparency. I mean, imagine if we didn't know how half of our third graders were reading, right? I know that's probably not where we'd start, but just as an example, it's really important to know how all of our third graders are reading. And it's really hard for me to get behind the notion that, we could sample it. And anyway, you get the point. It's hard to come up with other examples too. I'm a little more open to, maybe doing it every other year or something like that. But again, it gets complicated in a hurry. And it's hard to come up with something that's clean. Kids are changing schools, so you have leakage all over the place. Different schools have different grade level structural changes built into them, so it's hard to do it at the same. I mean, it gets messy really quickly. And my personal feeling is we should probably be going in the opposite direction and doing what we're doing in third through eighth grade, starting in second grade or first grade or kindergarten. I realize that accountability is kind of under assault and testing is under assault a little bit. But I think the best defense is a good offense. And I don't know. I think it's important that we do what we're doing.
Reminds me of what I said
Yeah,
once at an AEI panel with Rick Hess way back in the NCLB days. And I was in the administration. We were asking about high school reform. I said, NCLB, don't end it, don't mend it, extend it into high school. So that's David's position. Extend testing even further. Hey, I like that too. Scott, what do you think? Is that the right answer? We're kind of the basic structure that ESSA requires is still right.
I think it's generally still right. So again, the unit of analysis, though, is we're not holding kids accountable with these tests. The unit of analysis is the school. So we could get good school measures with matrix sampling. And it wouldn't be every other kid testing like NAEP sampling is, Mike, you might get items 1 through 5 on a test. David gets items 6 through 10. I get items 11 through 15, blah, blah, blah. We get to 200 items across the class. So we get rich information. The problem is having that conversation with a parent. I had little Mikey sit in class for 3 hours and take this test, and you're not getting a score. That's just not going to fly. So there's ways to do these hybrid kinds of things to extend that. And I'm interested in having richer performance tasks, but they take a lot of time. So you could have a core part of the test that's, maybe the kind of more items that we're familiar with that are a little faster, but then you matrix sample performance tasks. So 3 of us might take 3 different performance tasks, but at a school, they would get information about all of them and solve some of the generalizability issues in performance assessments, et cetera. So there's ways to do it. We did a study, my colleague Will Laurier and I and some others, where we looked at it was funded by Gates and Walton, looked at what would happen if you did every other year. We did you remember the Bowman bill, grade span doesn't work because you can't do growth. Every other year is okay if you consider the same accountability system, but it's not as good. And the kids that are more likely to churn are the kids we really want to keep an eye on the most. So that's right.
And that matrix sampling, and the matrix sampling, I mean, you need every kid to have a score to be able to do growth, right?
So yes, right. So you give up. That's right. You have to be willing to be clear about what you value. So if you value growth, then don't go to every other year. We've done it, but it just doesn't work as well as every year.
All right. That is fair. So, here we are. I feel like, again, the analogy is Margaret Spellings used to say about NCLB that it was like ivory soap, 99% pure. Maybe we want to go that far in ESSA. But look, the point is the requirements that are there right now at the federal level are not all that onerous, right? Grades 3 through 8, once in high school, and it allows us to have the ability to measure student level growth, at least at the end of elementary school and into middle school. And that's super important. And I appreciate you making this strong case, both in the paper and here. So Scott Marion, Executive Director of the Center for Assessment, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you guys. I'm glad you're, it's nice that we're all on the same side on this. And we have a case for accountability that just was released as well. So I'm sure you'll back that. So thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Check that out. Thanks, Scott. Okay, now it's time for everyone's favorite, Amber's Research Minute. Adam, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back.
Adam Tyner filling in for Amber on Amber's Research Minute. All right, guys, real quick before we get into today's research, I wrote recently about the best colleges for political diversity, right? Or you might say ideological diversity, viewpoint diversity. Basically, these are places that have a relatively decent balance between liberals and conservatives on campus, which, as you can imagine, especially among the most selective colleges, it is not easy to find those. I found 5 schools that are both highly selective and also have relative balance. I noticed, David, your Pomona, 3-1 liberal to conservatives, which actually among highly selective schools is not that bad.
Yeah, it's probably not exactly what I would have predicted. Actually, that's not bad.
Yeah, I mean, Pitzer was like, which is right next door, right? Is like 75-1, which was
Yes,
Crazy.
nobody at Pomona or any of the other 5Cs will be surprised by those numbers, Mike.
Yeah.
Sorry, this is students or faculty?
This is students. This is students. Now,
75 to 1?
75 to 1. There was a college, I think it was McAllister, where not a single student surveyed said they were a conservative. So that's not even, there's no ratio, right? It's just infinity, I guess. So, Adam, your University of Oklahoma didn't quite make the cut. It was a little too liberal still, 2-1 liberal to conservative. But Oklahoma State qualified, which I thought was interesting. And so did a lot of the big schools, the sort of SEC, Big 10, Big 12 schools that people would recognize qualified as well. So, look, obviously young people tend to lean left, colleges lean left, but it is possible to find a political balance if you want. And so it's one of these things where a lot of columnists are always bemoaning the fact that, you go to these elite schools and everybody's liberal, you don't get real viewpoint diversity. That's largely true, but you can find it if you look for it. So
Where was Michigan at?
Michigan was about 3-1, like Pomona. So there was a lot in there, around 3-1, 4-1. That was pretty typical among the selective schools. And I'll let you all guess. You'll have to go look it up. The 5 schools that are highly selective and politically balanced. It's an interesting list. All right, but we must turn to more serious research than what I can do with my little tables and adding and subtracting that I like to do. Adam, what you got this week?
Well, I've got a good one for you guys this week. This week, we have a brand new working paper that dives into an intriguing debate in school accountability. How seriously should we take the results of so-called school climate surveys? The researchers, led by economist Josh Angrist of MIT, used data from the country's largest public school district, New York City, to compare the value of these survey data with the predictive value of yours and my favorite data point, test score value added measures. So first, just a little background. In recent years, a lot of districts, including New York City, have made student and teacher surveys a key part of their school report cards. I think the idea is that these surveys are capturing important factors, stuff like school climate and supportive relationships that might not show up in test scores. In New York, the official school performance dashboard includes aggregated measures of what students say about their learning environment. And so, for example, you'll have a measure like the proportion of students who say that they, quote, learn a lot from feedback on their work. Now, critics have said that these measures are like too vague. Then other people say that the surveys reflect an important dimension of school quality, maybe one that's even more important than test scores. And there are 14 states that include these kinds of measures in their accountability systems. So the paper we're talking about today investigates whether schools that produce good survey scores actually propel students to long-term success in high school and beyond, and compares the predictive validity of the surveys to that of test score value added. The authors use value-added models for all of the outcomes to show how attending a particular school shifts a student's likelihood of hitting certain academic milestones relative to a baseline. Those outcomes include whether students graduate high school on time, earn a more advanced diploma, enroll in college, and persist in college. The researchers also pull in the survey results, those big climate and engagement questionnaires, and combine them with test score data and later outcome data across multiple cohorts in New York City. The data cover middle schools and high schools in New York City, including students in the cohort beginning 5th grade in 2015 and students who were in the 8th grade applying to high schools from 2012 to 2016. Now, by comparing schools with similar student populations, that means we're controlling for demographics and prior performance, the researchers isolate the causal impact of the individual schools, or at least that's the attempt. Then they check whether each type of measure, the survey level or the test-based value added, does a better job predicting which schools truly move the needle on those outcomes. I should underline here that the survey data are not a value added kind of thing, because only the averages for each school are reported. And so this is not an entirely apples to apples comparison of the two measures of school quality, although it is the survey levels as they use them that are used in New York's accountability system. Okay, so what they find is that for predicting the odds of a student receiving a standard Regents diploma, that's the normal diploma in New York, survey measures seem to outperform test score value added as a signal of school effectiveness. Interpreting the magnitude of the effects is kind of hard because we're comparing two different measures of school effectiveness. They're already kind of abstract. But what I can say is that in both middle and high school analyses, survey levels, those climate surveys, are considerably more correlated than test score value added when you look at the school's value added for high school graduation. But then they find exactly the opposite for all of the longer term measures of academic outcomes. So test score value added is much more correlated with the school getting its students to earn an advanced diploma, go to college, and even persist in college than the survey levels indicator. Now, after accounting for test score value added, the surveys add little to no explanatory power for those later outcomes. So that means that if you want to figure out which schools will boost the chances of a student actually thriving in a rigorous college prep environment and eventually heading off to college and persisting there, test-based measures are better than the survey data that New York uses. It's worth noting, and I'll end with this, that in 2023, New York City started publicly posting value-added style data on high school graduation and college enrollment at the school level. So New Yorkers now have this more direct read on whether a school is really adding value when it comes to its long-term success. It's kind of like a growth measure, but for a specific outcome. And there's a good case that having that value-added data may reduce some of the guesswork that goes into picking a school when you're basing it just on kind of test level or on stuff like climate surveys. That said, from a policy standpoint, there's still obviously some tension between the push to emphasize non-cognitive indicators, which do matter for some outcomes, and the continued need to prioritize academic rigor.
Okay, very well, Adam. But so, I've got thoughts both about the surveys versus the tests or in combination with the tests, but also about high school graduation, right? I mean, look, listeners know I am very skeptical, maybe cynical of the way that we hold the line for high school graduation. In other words, we have mostly given up on holding the line. We don't do it anymore. I mean, we do everything we can to get kids to graduate, even kids who, really under any kind of standard are not meeting the standard. They're not showing up for school. They're barely, we let them click through some, computer program to let them earn credit, that kind of stuff. So I just don't find it persuasive. Anything that looks at, defining a high school's own effectiveness based on their own graduation rate, right? I just think is suspect. So I think it's interesting that a middle school's impact on high school graduation, that I can buy. There's at least, more distance there. And the middle school doesn't have control exactly over the high school graduation rate, but the high school does, so what is this saying? Like maybe these schools that create this more warm, belonging environment, where the kids feel, a lot of engagement, are also the ones that are basically doing everything they can to get kids to graduate. Maybe some of that's good. Maybe some of that's not so good. Right.
Yeah. And I think it's worth pointing out, well, this is in New York, and New York is one of the states that still has some checks for students to graduate. It's not like only the schools have complete control over who graduates and who passes courses. That's how it is in most states, like you were saying. In most states, basically a high school can get the teachers to pass the students, and that's all it really takes just to earn those credits in order to graduate. And New York has the Regents exams, and so students do have to pass a set of exams. And I understand there's some workarounds and everything, and people are concerned that the Regents exams, the level isn't high enough and everything, but it's not as bad as it would be in most other states.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. Although my understanding is, there definitely are ways for kids to graduate without passing the Regents exam, which, by the way, that high school graduation requirement is going away. So there you go. But look, this notion that test score value added is the best predictor in value, of long-term outcomes. We've seen that in other studies, I believe, right? And I think that's tells us that, okay, when we think about measuring school effectiveness based on test score value added, we are on a pretty good path. And so, by all means, if we get more information from these surveys, that's fine. But we should be careful to, for example, change school grades based on the results of those surveys. I don't know. What do you think, David? Am I poo-pooing the survey results too much?
No, I don't think you are. I guess one thing I would say is, if kids in their survey responses are saying, I don't know, my school is unsafe, or, I don't feel like I belong, like that's a problem, just full stop, right? So like I think, you can recognize that these data provide value, and also at the same time recognize that they're not a great way to gauge school quality, right? It's not a value added measure. It's a measure of sort of their community well-being is kind of where my mind goes, right? There's a lot more I could say, right? Like, because we just did this project on sort of, GPA value added, we called it, right? As sort of an alternative measure that's getting at some of these other things that, they do matter. Maybe they don't matter as much as test-based value added, honestly. It's kind of hard to say. I mean, one of the things I learned in that, project, right, is, or that it highlighted is, we're not talking about the same kids, right? When we talk about the kids who maybe are, more likely to graduate versus the kids who are more likely to, go to college and complete it, right? Like it makes total sense that these things would not be correlated with each other, right? They're just fundamentally different. They're different kids. They're different things. It also doesn't shock me that, that some of these things that we care about in high school, like belonging, like that they're not that sticky, right? Like they don't, I didn't feel like I belonged in high school either necessarily, right? But that didn't have a whole lot of bearing on whether I could pass my math course in college, right? What mattered was whether I had, internalized some basic skills that they were taking for granted, right? At like on day one of the class. So, I think that the results make sense to me. I think at a very high level, like when we're talking about accountability, I think we have to, for me at least, it's about trying to square a circle, right? On the one hand, we know that schools have complex effects, right? On the other hand, if we just have a dashboard and we just throw all the data up there, then we're not really sending a clear signal to parents or anyone else about what the bottom line is. So for me, my personal bias is always that, like, look, let's moneyball this, right? Let's get a whole bunch of, tech guys, whizzy, statistics guys together and have them tell us, of course, if you throw a bunch of measures in there, you're going to get sort of better predictiveness of long-term outcomes, right? Like, it may not be much better, but you can do better than just tests. But then I feel like
in most cases that's true, although here they didn't add any additional.
No, that's right. Here they didn't. Okay, but I like at a sort of basic level, my sense is that you can improve on it, right, if you work at it. But then at the end of the day, you have to sort of boil it down into either a single grade or just a couple of grades, or star ratings or something that helps people make sense of it. So I think you can. Anyway, I think you can have a sort of sophisticated, data-savvy, complex approach to measuring school quality and have a simple way of reporting it. And I think sort of that's the key. But I agree, this is a very like pro-test-based value-added result, ultimately.
Yeah. One last point, Adam, is, of course, in New York, unlike a lot of places, they have this very sophisticated school choice system. Some of these schools are selective, so how to think about how that might be playing out is another thing, right? Would the Stuyvesants of the world have a hard time showing value added because the kids come in so high achieving, but maybe they do a great job with the student engagement stuff. I mean, I don't know, that seems to be and I don't know, I imagine that must have been a tough thing for them to try to figure out how to study and control.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, Mike, because they do use the kind of randomness within the system. Because people put in a list of choices, and then there's some element of randomness and lottery that goes into where they go in order to calculate the value added for the outcomes, like the high school graduation and everything. And so they're actually quite careful about that, and I think that gives the study a lot more kind of validity.
Okay, interesting. All right, well, thank you, Adam. Good stuff, and we look forward to having you come back on here sometime soon. Folks, that is all the time we've got for today, though. So until next week,
I'm David Griffith.
and I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.